The State of the Funny Bone by Florence King from Reflections in a Jaundiced Eye has a few off-color words. Any discussion of the problems of being funny in America will not make sense unless we substitute the word wit for humor. Humor inspires sympathetic, good-natured laughter and is favored by the healing power gang. Wit goes for the jugular, not the jocular, and it's the opposite of football. Instead of building character, it tears it down. It's no accident that wit is practically an archaic word in American English. Wit has never played well in America, for reasons not hard to discern. The first is democracy. Wit is not a democratic form. The two adjectives most often used to modify it are those weapons of Renaissance aristocrats, rapier and stiletto. Most Americans don't stop and think what these words represent, but they know instinctively that wit is elitist. History bears them out. The last civilizations to welcome wit were those last outposts of aristocracy, 18th century France and England, homes to the famous conversational salons. Aristocrats are comfortable with wit because they're socially secure. Knowing they could get away with anything simply because they were who they were, Versailles courtiers and Whig peeresses traded bon mots and double entendres without restraint. Then the guillotine started crashing, the Industrial Revolution started clanking, and wit was drowned out in the clamor of democracy and the rise of the middle class. Both found their natural home in America, where no-holds-barred wit fell victim to the desire for respectability and the restraint demanded by social mobility. Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is an excellent way to choke. Living in dread of saying the wrong thing, American climbers rejected wit and embraced the favorite of the self-made man, the tall tale. The next blow was struck by our great diversity. A heterogeneous population might be good for the body politic, but it's bad for the funny bone. Wit and its handmaidens, satire and parody, require a common ground, an audience of conspirators who are privy to your intentions and a strong point of view, all of which conflict with that miasmic national squish we call consensus. Our unmelted pot has truncated American wit by depriving us of a national comic figure or tick that everyone can identify with. The French have the miser, the Irish have the biddy, the Italians have the jealous husband, the English have Colonel Blimp. But what does America have? Paul Bunyan, Dagwood Bumstead, Babbitt, the Cracker Barrel philosopher, the traveling salesman, the Southern senator, the Jewish mother, the Boston Brahmin, the Main Line Philadelphian, and the good old boy, to name just a few. At first glance, it seems like a rich comedic heritage with something for everybody. And it is, which is just the trouble. What is funny to millions of Americans leaves millions of others bemused. We may catch cross-cultural jokes, but we don't feel them. We know the words, but not the tune. A country in which one man's aberration is another man's ethos obscures wit's most tempting target. If you can't tell who the eccentrics are, you can't tell who the conventional people are. And if you don't know who the conventional people are, it's impossible to be witty at their expense. Our great diversity also kills the spontaneity that wit needs. In his 1921 book, American Civilization, historian Harold Stearns called America a polyglot boarding house. We have learned to watch our boarding house reach when seated at the national dinner table. We are so afraid of giving offense to this or that group that we have turned into oral basket cases. Our worst nightmare is that backbone of wit, the generalization. Samuel Johnson could say, "If you give a Scot something, he'll either break it or drink it." But that sort of remark would cause mass cardiac arrest in the land of the free and the home of Jimmy the Greek. Teddy Kennedy, Jesse Jackson, Daniel Inouye, Gloria Steinem, and Ira Glasser would all go on Nightline and say, "Some Scots are clumsy drunks, but the vast majority of Scottish Americans are well-educated and responsible citizens." There goes your sprightly discourse. It's impossible to talk coherently when compassionate humanitarians keep popping up and saying, "some." If you want to see the some factor in action, watch Phil Donahue. The show that sticks in my mind featured a white lesbian, a black lesbian, and the black lesbian's child, who had been fathered by the white lesbian's brother via artificial insemination. The show was already a perfect gift for the feminist who has everything, but Donahue had to add even more democratic balance. When the white lesbian, who was from Louisiana, said that her mother had all the prejudices about color that Southerners have, Philippe Egalite leaped in with "some Southerners." Not daring to trust each other to filter sweeping statements, we clutter up our speech and writing with awkward adverbial easements like "generally speaking" and "by and large," dragging in carefully documented exceptions on the grappling hooks of equivocation until we get so tangled up in what we're trying not to say that we produce oxymoronic gems, as when we try to be fair to every ethnic group and come out with Americans of all nationalities. Hardly what Alexander Pope had in mind when he defined wit as "what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed." Wit is rooted in the personality traits of the intelligent loner. The witty person characteristically takes a dim view of human nature, and may even be a misanthrope like Jonathan Swift, who inadvertently gave us a chummy figure of speech when he said, "I hate and despise the animal called man, though I like the occasional Tom, Dick, or Harry." That sort of sentiment, like Dorothy Parker's definition of wit, the humor of the indifferent, does not go over big in a land where headline writers see nothing wrong with "Hearts Go Out to Brainless Baby." Our desperate commitment to love and compassion makes us reject corrosive rejoinders in favor of the bland, hail fellow well met heartiness and tense jocularity of the toastmaster's gentle dig. Even on the rare occasions when some American does get savagely indignant, he instinctively reins himself in and tries to blunt his remarks. Asked what should be done about Jerry Falwell, Barry Goldwater flashed a friendly grin and said somebody ought to kick him in the ass. It was supposed to be funny, but as Somerset Maugham observed, there's not much kick in the milk of human kindness. Goldwater's retort makes one recall Cyrano's line, "Oh, sir, what you could have said," in his speech about the art of insult. Many years ago, in a similar exchange, an American produced a witticism that would have won plaudits from both Cyrano and Maugham. Asked what he thought of William Jennings Bryan, the frosty Charles Francis Adams replied, "He is in one sense scripturally formidable, for he is unquestionably armed with the jawbone of an ass." Today such a statement would be a candidate for damage control. Nice guyism and melting-pot nervousness have made a mortal sin of putting people down, but the practice has its uses. Certain kinds of unflattering jokes have always helped keep society functioning in a reasonably civilized way. In the one about the old goat and the spring chicken, pitiless references to the foolish age used to discourage many older men from acting out their fantasies, lest they end up in a punchline. Now smarmy compassion has joined forces with pseudoscience to produce solemn pronouncements like self-realization and midlife crisis that gives such men a perfect guiltless excuse to jump the fence. Bemoaners of sexual harassment might like to recall that the traveling salesman joke protected unescorted women from unwelcome attentions. Known unflatteringly as a drummer or a masher, the anecdotal traveling salesman became such a nationally famous symbol of crudeness that a woman could get rid of an importunate man merely by calling him by the generic name. She may have been less than respectable herself, but it didn't matter. A traveling salesman was worse. Theodore Dreiser was able to make the complacent heroine of Sister Carrie a sympathetic character because she was seduced by traveling salesman Charles Drouet. After that, nothing was her fault. The Iceman joke saved bored housewives from themselves. The punchline scene of the husband coming back home unexpectedly and finding a block of melting ice on the kitchen floor was so firmly embedded in the national psyche that people dreaded getting involved in a clumsy afternoon affair. The human spirit recoils from the idea of turning into a cliché. Today, however, such a comedy of errors is given the humorless name of encounter and credited with saving marriages. No less a humanitarian than George Orwell defended putting people down when he wrote, "Jokes about nagging wives and tyrannous mothers-in-law do at least imply a stable society in which marriage is indissoluble and family loyalties taken for granted." Our quest for bigger and better is at odds with wit. Well-aimed thrusts depend upon subtlety, understatement, and a poker face, as in Noel Coward's definition of a gentleman. A man who can play the bagpipes, but doesn't. But the American mind associates subtlety with sneakiness, understated with underhanded, and poker faces with hostile Indians. American pragmatism is another of wit's enemies. We want everything to be practical and useful, but the pinnacle of wit is the jeu d'esprit, wit for its own sake, with no purpose but sheer joy in words. The jeu d'esprit ought to be popular in a country obsessed with every other kind of game, but it collides with our preference for the quick and easy. It takes a lot of reading and reflection to come up with puns, maxims, epigrams, and ripostes. But Americans can't be bothered. Our wish to be clever without going to the trouble of being learned is reflected throughout our culture. One example is Cosmopolitan's notorious italics, designed to substitute for archness. Another is the pillow talk scene in mass-market movies and novels. Max Ehrlich's Reincarnation in Venice encourages people who don't have anything witty to say it anyway. Herewith, the lovers as they wake up in bed together and have a go at sexual repartee. Quote, "My dear Mr. Drew, yes, Miss Knox. This is to inform you that it has been quite an adventure to have you in my bed. You will do. Speaking as a primitive, as a vital and lusty female, you will most definitely do, sir. You are what we call a very macho man. Very. There happens to be a reason for that. Yes? You are a very female. She laughed and kissed him for that. You know, we could stay in bed all day. We could. Except that would be just too decadent. I mean, even us Sybarites have to take time out to eat. Why don't we make a supreme effort? I mean, get out of bed while I make us some breakfast. After that." End quote. That's the most rollicking bedroom jeu d'esprit since Atlas Shrugged. Wit cannot survive a Noah's Ark atmosphere dominated by self-conscious pairing. Speaking on America's worship of marriage, our leading expatriate Henry James said, "An amiable bachelor here and there doesn't strike me at all amiss, and I think he too may forward the cause of civilization." Wit flourished in the conversational salons of 18th century Europe, largely because these gatherings were not attended by couples. By contrast, American husbands and wives go everywhere together and spend the evening signaling each other about what not to say with daggerish stares, elbows in the ribs, kicks under the table, and hisses of "shut up," lest a clever riposte arouse fear and loathing in the other married couples who go everywhere together. These are the same people who reply, "a good sense of humor," in surveys about the qualities they look for in a mate. They say it because they know they're supposed to say it. They know they're supposed to say it because they read "Laughter the Best Medicine" in Reader's Digest. What they mean is something quite different. The man who aims to want a wife with a good sense of humor is looking for that quality of benumbed resignation found in women of the type known as good sports. The woman who claims to want a husband with a good sense of humor is actually looking for someone who won't be mean to the children. The most important reason why wit fails in America is sexual insecurity. Wit is aggressive and therefore masculine. At the same time, it's waspish and therefore feminine. Therefore, witty people are queer. The witty woman is a tragic figure in American life. Wit destroys eroticism, and eroticism destroys wit. So women must choose between taking lovers and taking no prisoners. As with stilettos and rapiers, the name of the game is adjectives. A woman who is sharp, incisive, and surgical is displeasing to men. Fear of being called a castrating female makes the majority of women rein themselves in and blunt their remarks lest they say to a man, as Dorothy Parker did, "With the crown of thorns I wear, why should I worry about a little prick like you?" Wit also requires an infinite supply of attitudes that have been bred out, trained out, and knocked out of women for centuries. Taught to say, "I love people, sex is beautiful," and her prayers, the average woman finds it impossible to summon the sang-froid, contempt, impatience, sarcasm, pessimism, blasphemy, and bawdiness required to crack ice at 30 paces. This state of affairs supposedly changed with the advent of feminism. Throughout the 70s, enormous efforts were made to get women to laugh at previously forbidden topics. Anthologies of humor for women appeared, including the one called Titters, containing a reprint of one of my pieces. But for the most part, the silence was deafening. Not that women didn't try. In a letter to Cosmopolitan about an article of mine, the reader allowed as how it probably was funny, but concluded with a mixture of plaintiveness and moral superiority. "I guess I take sex seriously." One problem was the mixed signals feminists gave out. On the one hand, they urged women to be raucous and bawdy, while on the other, they promoted the "I am a humorless feminist" t-shirt. Another problem was the catch-all nature of the women's movement. If, like the suffragettes, feminists had concentrated exclusively on women and ignored other dispossessed groups, they could have helped women develop the healthy selfishness that lies behind the merry outlook. But in their zeal to stroke and identify with every have-not cause under the sun, they created a chaos of caring that forced women back into the age-old female trap of putting others before self. The women and wit conundrum came to a head in a 1976 book called The Curse, A Cultural History of Menstruation by Janice Delaney, Mary Jane Lupton, and Emily Toth. In a chapter on menstruation jokes, this earnest trio came up with one of the finest oxymorons of all time. "We would like to think that feminism will help women develop a different sense of humor, one that is warm, loving, egalitarian, compassionate." That's like telling people to have calm orgasms. One of the hardest things for the world to accept is a woman who laughs at sex while remaining above the battle. A woman is never allowed to be detached about sex. She must either pull out all the stops and be filthy, what nightclub comics call working blue, or make herself the butt of the joke and poke fun at her own sexuality. I ran up against both of these non-choices in the 70s when I wrote for two new magazines aimed at liberated women. The first was Playgirl, whose male publisher conceived the idea of a monthly fictional vignette centering around a funny sexual encounter. The editor asked me to write it and passed on the publisher's instructions: make it raunchy. I have always thought that raunch ought to be the French word for armpit, like manche for sleeve. The difference between raunchy and witty can be illustrated by two remarks on the same subject. The raunchy remark is from a movie whose title I have forgotten. In one scene, a couple who work together are about to have sex on an office desk when the phone rings. The man answers it and says, "I can't talk now. Something big has come up." The witty remark was made by the Edwardian actress, Mrs. Patrick Campbell, the first Eliza Doolittle, who eloped during rehearsals of Pygmalion. When she returned to work after a 4-day honeymoon, George Bernard Shaw asked, "What is this new husband of yours like?" Replied Mrs. Pat, 6 feet 4 and everything in proportion. I lasted through 3 Playgirl vignettes. The one that got me fired was about a woman who was so desperate to find her clitoris that she decided to use a divining rod. The publisher blew up when he read my lead. The clitoris is the whistle stop between maidenhead and personhood on the feminist train of thought. The editor told me later that he stormed through the office waving my manuscript and yelling, "That's not raunchy. Suppose Linda Lovelace had said that in Deep Throat. It would have ruined the movie." Next, Viva, the sister publication of Penthouse, asked me to be their sex advice columnist, a contributing editorship with my name on the masthead. It was the heyday of the kinky sex fad. The readers desperately wanted to believe that earnest cliché, "Anything two people do together is right as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else." So I was under orders to find a funny way of reassuring them that sex is beautiful. I quickly discovered that when the Penthouse empire tells a woman to be funny, they really mean kooky. I have always thought that kook ought to be the Arabic word for a woman who has a nervous breakdown in the middle of a belly dance. A kook is a sick handmaiden assigned to the male tent and given the job of seeing to it that men always laugh at, never with, the female sex. She accomplishes this by combining Belle Watling's heart of gold with Aunt Pittypat's instability to become the kind of sex partner men call that crazy kid. A century ago, a kook was a girl who jumped naked out of a cake at stag parties. Today, she's the chief purveyor of the attitude known as non-judgmental. Viva expected me to top the sexual experiences related by the readers with even more bizarre ones, real or imagined, of my own, and to write in a warm and friendly "wait till I tell you what I did" tone, calculated to soothe their guilty fears and make them feel loved. Here is the letter that got me fired. Question: My boyfriend wants me to stick a lighted 4th of July sparkler in his ass while we fuck. Is this wrong? Answer: No, provided he has more than one ass to give for your country. Thank you for listening very much.